The broadcast opened with 5 terrified women kneeling under floodlights on a cold steel platform, their hands bound behind them, their faces pale and streaked with soot, as the metallic wind from the upper vents swept across the open chamber, making the flames of the ceremonial torches flicker like dying stars. The guards stood in perfect formation around them, black armored figures with rifles held tight across their chests and helmets that hid every trace of emotion, and behind them loomed the execution tower, a rusted column of imperial engineering built for public punishment and political theater. The crowd was vast and restless, rows of seats packed with spectators, diplomats, mercenaries, media drones, and imperial citizens, some watching through virtual feeds, others attending in person to witness justice in its most brutal form. Children sat beside parents wearing empire crests on their shoulders, cheering for death as though it were a festival and not an atrocity. And still the 5 women said nothing. They had no voice, no defense, no trial, just a final act, written for them by those who wore command badges and gave orders from behind. Armored glass, each of the women had a name, but no one spoke them. Each had a story, but no one listened. They were numbers now. Enemy assets, traitors marked by association, accused of aiding rebel fugitives, though their files were redacted even from internal review units, and whispers had spread that they were used as bait. But no one knew bait for what no one cared to ask, because in the Empire asking meant guilt, and guilt meant flames above them. On a wide screen the imperial insignia burned bright, a signal of dominance that filled the entire arena with a silent weight. And then the announcement began. The warden, his voice deep and theatrical, started reading the charges against them: crimes against unity, violations of order, conspiracy with resistance networks, treason of the highest class. And as his words echoed across the station, the crowd roared in response, chanting the old Empire war phrase, "Purge the roots before the rot spreads." The women looked ahead, but not at the crowd. Their eyes were distant, fixed on something beyond the execution tower, something behind the glare of the lights and the heat of the stage. And while one of them silently mouthed a name, another closed her eyes, not in fear but in focus, as if listening for a sound she alone could recognize, perhaps a voice or a signal or a memory of someone she once believed gone forever. Camera drone hovered low, capturing every expression, every tremble, every flicker of resistance or regret, and the feed was streamed across dozens of systems, scheduled to replay every 4 hours until the news cycle replaced them with new enemies and new executions. And behind the scenes the warden received a final authorization code from Central Command, a blinking green light that meant the pyres could be activated in the next cycle, and the women would burn in silence while the galaxy watched and the Empire celebrated another 5 lessons taught through fire. But far from the platform, beyond the reach of imperial censors, something ancient and ruthless had just woken from the dead. No one cared who they were. The charges were vague, the sentence was final, and the names of the 5 women had been erased from the public record, replaced by identification numbers and asset tags used only by imperial clerks and detention staff. Even their faces were blurred in official releases, but that did not matter to the masses, who only needed a target to hate and a spectacle to enjoy as the countdown to their execution ticked louder with every passing hour inside detainment station. Zeta 9. The air was stale with recycled dust and rusted metal. The walls were coated with grime, from decades of forgotten prisoners and faded bloodstains, and the halls echoed with the sounds of boots and distant screams and the occasional metallic groan of the gravity stabilizers failing under strain. Above them were hundreds of cells filled with the broken and the discarded, enemies of the Empire, rebels, thieves, dissidents, even children born to the wrong parents. And down in the deepest level, beneath all others, were the 5 marked for death. They were separated but not entirely isolated, kept in cells of reinforced plasma glass, monitored by thermal drones and biometric scans. Their food was delivered through tubes, and their clothing was regulation, gray, thin, and colorless like ash. One of the women stared at the ceiling for hours, never blinking, not speaking. Another traced a symbol onto the wall over and over again, something meaningless to the guards but ancient to her people. A prayer, perhaps, or a name, or a promise. The warden believed this execution would be his legacy. He wore his medals over his chest armor and rehearsed his speech daily in front of the mirror, quoting the Imperial Codex line by line with dramatic pauses and artificial tears. He invited his superiors and arranged for a wide broadcast across 74 systems, promising that this act would send fear through the stars and cement Zeta 9 as the Empire's greatest deterrent. But there was one thing he had not accounted for, something not listed in the files. something redacted from the network, something even the security AI flagged as anomaly data and moved to quarantine without alerting command. Each of the women had been flagged once, long ago, under a different classification, not as civilians, but as next of kin to active Imperial assets, and that file was buried under 13 levels of encryption long forgotten after a purge operation had declared those assets Kia. Guards joked about the women in the cafeteria, speculating about their pasts, mocking the idea that they had once lived normal lives, suggesting they had sold secrets for credits, or taken lovers in the rebel fleet. But no one knew the truth. No one even suspected that beyond the outer colonies, past the ghost sectors, in a place known only by a dead call sign 5. Men were moving without permission, without orders, without mercy. They were supposed to be dead, erased in an operation that never officially happened, burned in a crash that left no wreckage, buried in reports that were sealed by war tribunals, and yet they were alive, waiting, watching, listening for the moment. They were needed again, and now their time had come because someone had made a mistake, someone had touched what belonged to them, and now 5 ghosts were coming home. Somewhere beyond the regulated space lanes, in a dead zone marked by old war beacons and broken satellites, a silent ship drifted beneath the cover of magnetic storms. Its exterior scorched from past battles, its engines cold but ready, its interior lit only by emergency strips glowing dim red like veins pulsing through the metal, and inside the ship 5 men stood, in silence, staring at a flickering hologram that showed the faces of the women they had each thought lost to them forever. Transmission had come through a scrambled channel, piggybacked on a forgotten beacon, one that should not have been broadcasting at all. And when the feed decrypted frame by frame, glitching and distorted the moment their eyes landed on the execution platform, everything else went silent. The only sound left was the low hum of the ship and the sharp intake of breath, as recognition punched through the years of distance, war and pain like a blade through armor reach. Man had a different reaction. One clenched his fists so tight his knuckles bled. Another whispered something in a language no longer spoken. A third turned and punched a steel wall, leaving a dent deep enough to echo. A fourth dropped to a knee, hands trembling, and the fifth stood still, unmoving, eyes locked on the screen like a hunter staring down a target that had dared to strike too close to home. They were the Nova Spectres, the last of a Black Ops unit the Empire itself had created, then buried, men trained in infiltration, elimination and sabotage, taught to kill without being seen, and to vanish without leaving a trace, until the Empire grew afraid of what it had built, and turned on them, ordering a mission that was supposed to be their final one, an ambush disguised as an assignment, a betrayal buried under Imperial lies and silence. But they had survived, barely scattered across dead moons and hostile worlds. Hunted by their own brothers, burned and broken, they had gone underground, wiping every trace of their existence, vanishing from every system, every scanner, every archive, waiting in the shadows for something they did not name, something that would call them back to life. This was it. They moved without a word, activating systems that had not been touched in years, recalibrating weapons, syncing their minds to old tactical rhythms as though no time had passed, and the mission began with no ceremony, no plan, no hesitation, because this was not war, this was personal, and each man knew his role without needing to ask. A black drive engaged, the ship vanished from standard tracking systems and began its silent path through old smuggler lanes, bypassing patrol routes, moving between gravity wells and shield barriers, like a shadow slipping through cracks in a mirror, every step calculated, every move already decided, not by logic but by instinct, by vengeance, by love and rage wrapped in stillback. In Zeta 9 the countdown was already ticking, loud and cold and final, but far away in the dark, something lethal had been set loose again, and this time it was not working for any flag or order. It was moving for blood, and no one in the Empire knew yet that death itself was coming for them. Inside detainment station Zeta 9, preparations for the execution moved forward with brutal efficiency, as if every bolt in the floor and every light in the ceiling had waited for this moment since the station was built. The torches lining the walls were tested, the broadcast drones were charged and programmed. The warden paced the control tower, rehearsing his speech one more time, as if the right tone would make the whole galaxy obey. The Empire system was ancient but functional, ion injectors calibrated for maximum visibility and pain, configured to incinerate matter without explosion, slow and deliberate, made to make the condemned suffer and the audience cheer. Each woman was scheduled for an individual broadcast, 5 separate executions, one every 2 hours, to extend the propaganda value across the cycle and keep ratings high on the Imperial news feed. Guards joked among themselves during checks, trading rumors about where the women came from. One said they were rebel spies, another claimed they were highborn defectors hiding in plain sight. Someone mentioned a whisper about their husbands, but no one took it seriously. The files were sealed and their pasts erased. They were nothing but objects. Now empty names, on a death list, serving their final purpose as fuel for the Empire's fear machine. But within the security servers, something strange had begun to happen. Subtle changes in the system. Logs, minor fluctuations in thermal readings, small shifts in gravity sensors. Reports were flagged by maintenance bots and dismissed by command as environmental interference from the outer ring storms. A common excuse when the truth was too inconvenient to examine. A janitor noticed that one of the hallway cameras had looped for 7 seconds but said nothing, because saying something meant paperwork, and questioning a glitch in Zeta 9 was a fast way to get reassigned to worse places or worse floors. And besides, it was nothing, just static, just an error like everything else on this old floating grave. Down in the holding level, the women were silent. They had stopped speaking days ago, perhaps out of exhaustion, perhaps out of defiance. One of them stared at the corner of her cell where the shadows shifted slightly whenever the guards walked by. Another kept her head low, counting something beneath her breath, over and over, numbers perhaps, or a code or a memory she needed to hold on to until it was time. The execution control room confirmed. The first sequence would begin at dusk local cycle time. The pyres would be primed, and the first woman would be brought to the stage, her identity still concealed for dramatic effect. The reveal would happen mid-broadcast when the fire licked her feet and the drones captured her final expression for maximum viewer impact. The warden signed the activation code and ordered the guards to suit up for parade. Protocol, everything was in motion, everything was clean, perfect, silent, mechanical, just like the Empire wanted it, and not a soul inside the station knew that 5 targets had just been marked by a system that should not exist anymore. 5 trajectories had been set through shadow code and deep signal. 5 names, locked in by those who never missed, and they were already inside. The execution tower loomed like a monument to fear, its scaffolding lined with flame channels and reinforced steel, its surface scarred from years of death and spectacle. The sun from the nearby gas giant burned through the viewing windows, casting long red shadows over the chamber like blood dripping through glass. The warden stood above it all, hands behind his back, eyes scanning the schedule countdowns, humming on every screen, marking time like a heartbeat that could not be stopped. The command staff were already gathered, dressed in polished uniforms, their faces expressionless as they reviewed the briefing once more, ensuring everything aligned with Imperial protocol. The feeds were live, the systems green, the audience projected to exceed 400 million across 32 core systems and 9 outer colonies. All eyes would be on Zeta 9 and its justice, and nothing could go wrong. Nothing ever had, because no one had ever dared interrupt the Empire before. Below the main chamber, the platform had been lowered for final inspections. Guards double-checked ignition levels and containment fields while engineers ran scans on atmospheric stability. One technician noticed a strange power dip in the secondary grid, but he was told to ignore it. The station was old, always had glitches. Besides, the show must go on, and the Empire did not tolerate delays. Not for something as small as a flicker in a wire. In her cell, the first woman remained kneeling, eyes closed, lips moving without sound, her heartbeat steady, her breathing slow as if she were meditating, or perhaps remembering something from a long time ago. A mission, a voice, a promise, and above her the lights dimmed for a second, just long enough for her to open her eyes and stare at the ceiling with calm certainty, because she knew what that meant. At the edge of the command deck, one of the junior officers received a private message on a device that should not have had network access, a line of code without source or origin that scrolled across the screen in ancient formatting. All it said was "turn around," and when he did, he saw nothing but the window, and beyond that the distant stars. But in that second he felt something watching from beyond those stars, something moving closer. In the lower docks, a security officer swiped her card for the 5th time, frowning at the unresponsive door, not knowing that the scanner had already been bypassed from the inside, that the access override had been fed through a ghost port that did not exist on any schematics, that something had slipped past all the alarms and was now inside the walls, moving silent and fast and angry. The warden finished his speech rehearsal, adjusted his collar, and prepared to descend to the platform where he would deliver final words before the fire consumed the first of the traitors, unaware that every step he took was being tracked by eyes that saw through walls and minds, that had memorized the blueprints of this place before it was even finished being built, because the Nova Spectres were not just inside the station, they were already in position. That same night, as the twin moons of the outer ring cast pale light across the spine of detainment, Station Zeta 9, the execution chamber, was locked and sealed, and final calibrations were being uploaded by command staff dressed in ceremonial black, their boots echoing down polished metal corridors, designed to carry sound like a whisper through steel, and the guards rotated posts in precise formation, unaware that half the cameras had begun to loop in exact 5-second intervals, just long enough for something or someone to slip between frames unseen within the ventilation system. Something moved, not like a creature but like thought itself. Weightless, deliberate, efficient, one hand gripping the edge of a shaft, another lowering, a silent blade that hummed with ancient energy modified and reforged during exile. It was not just a weapon, it was memory and vengeance and purpose, combined into a single killing edge, and behind the blade was a man who had not spoken his real name in years. The first Spectre dropped silently into the fuel chamber, bypassed 3 layers of biometric lock, using only a sliver of old code still buried deep inside the Empire's own forgotten firmware, the kind that only the dead were supposed to remember. He planted a thermal charge in the ignition matrix, small enough not to be noticed, but powerful enough to stall the fire systems for exactly 90 seconds, and then he vanished again into the shadows that welcomed him like an old friend. In the surveillance wing, another Spectre emerged from a supply crate that had passed every scan, hidden behind shielding that mimicked empty cargo. He slit the throat of the technician in the booth before the man even realized the door had opened, and dragged the body under the desk, then plugged a device into the central console, a virus so elegant it whispered instead of roared, one that fed false data to every terminal and camera except one, the one that the Spectres used to see each other down. In the crew barracks, a third Spectre moved among the off-duty guards dressed in stolen armor and carrying a forged ID chip. He laughed at their jokes, nodded at their crude stories, and waited until they were distracted before slipping a small black vial into the air recycler, one that would cause dizziness, blurred vision, and slow reflexes for the next 6 hours. No fatalities, just weakness, just enough to ensure they could not fight at full strength. When the time came near the docking bay, the fourth Spectre intercepted an inbound maintenance drone, reprogrammed it mid-flight, and sent it coasting through a maintenance corridor, its signal now carrying a set of override codes to disable the platform clamps during the broadcast window. And no one saw the drone because no one looked where they thought control already existed, and that was the Spectre's true strength. They moved in places no one remembered and attacked from angles no one planned, pharaohed in the final cell beneath it all. The fifth Spectre stood in silence behind a false panel, his eyes locked on the woman who had once worn a silver ring on her finger, one that matched his, and though she could not see him, yet he whispered something through the just 2 words, "Wait, love," and she closed her eyes and smiled for the first time in weeks. 2 guards vanished from their posts during final security sweep, just gone, no alarms. No alerts, no calls for backup, only silence and confusion when the replacements arrived to find empty rifles leaned against a wall and helmets neatly placed on a bench, as if the missing men had simply taken a break and never returned. The officer in charge shrugged, logged the absence as equipment malfunction, and moved on, because Zeta 9 was always breaking somewhere, and no one wanted to be the one to delay an Imperial execution. In the control tower, the countdown began. Its final cycle lights pulsed red across the upper levels, warning all systems to prepare for live broadcast feeds. The data lines buzzed with compressed signals and encryption layers, and across the galaxy millions tuned in, watching the screen where the execution chamber now glowed with low heat, light, and slow panning camera angles capturing every dramatic shadow, every movement of the guards as they lined up in formation. Around the central pyre, the first woman was being prepped in the transfer corridor. Her arms secured her steps, measured by 2 guards who had no idea the path they walked was already marked by a silent signal beam that guided a Spectre through parallel vents overhead, watching every turn, every movement, every breath. His hand hovered near the release trigger, a silent command, waiting to be given, and once it was, nothing would stop what came next. Far above in the communications array, the virus had reached its final stage, and one by one the feeds began to fragment across civilian broadcasts. A flicker here, a loop there, a strange delay in the audio. Then a sudden blur of static as the camera drone inside the chamber lost visual for exactly 12 seconds, enough time for the floor clamps to disengage and for one hidden panel beneath the pyre to open just wide enough for a hand to slip through. The second woman received a message through a hidden pulse inside her collar, a pattern of taps only she would recognize, an old signal once used during exile when communications were impossible and eyes were everywhere. Her eyes widened for just a moment, then narrowed as her heartbeat slowed and her breathing leveled, and she stood straighter, taller, as if she had just remembered who she truly was. A technician monitoring internal motion sensors noticed strange anomalies, but every time he zoomed in, the footage would loop or distort or blink out entirely, so he submitted a routine bug report and moved on, unaware that his station had already been rerouted to a false visual system fed by a specter who now stood less than 10 meters from the central chamber wall, waiting for his cue back. In the broadcast room, the warden adjusted his coat, stepped onto the main floor, and raised his hands as the lights dimmed and the signal flare began pulsing red, blue, gold, the execution colors of the Empire, and his voice thundered through the speakers, delivering the opening lines of judgment. But before he could speak the final word, the lights flickered once, twice, then went blackened. The darkness, 5 systems shut down at once, and 5 men moved like blades through water, and no one had time to scream before the storm began. As the lights failed across Detainment Station Zeta 9, chaos struck like a silent scream buried in metal. The emergency beacons blinked once, then died, and the sound of system failure echoed louder than any alarm. The warden froze mid-sentence, his mouth open, his words stolen by the void as the camera drones spun out of control, crashing into the walls or plummeting into the flames that had just begun to spark beneath the platform. The audience feed cut to black across the galaxy, leaving millions staring at static and confusion inside the darkness. That specters moved not like soldiers but like storms. One dropped from the vent above the ignition chamber, landing in perfect silence behind a technician who never even turned before. The blade pierced his spine, clean and quiet. The specter accessed the control panel, rerouted power to the auxiliary grid, and opened the concealed exit beneath the pyre, just wide enough for the woman above to fall through. When the time came, the guards scrambled, yelling for lights, for backup, for answers, but all channels were jammed. Their earpieces screamed with static, their weapons useless in the pitch black, and worse still, the oxygen scrubbers began to cycle improperly, flooding the lower levels with thin air, causing dizziness, slurred speech, delayed reflexes. All part of the plan, all part of the preparation laid carefully across days of silent work, from ghosts who had never stopped watching. The first woman felt her restraints unlock automatically. The nanolock snapped with a hiss, and she dropped to one knee as the floor beneath her cracked open, and a hand reached up to pull her down into darkness, into safety, into the arms of a man she had not seen in years but never forgotten. And when their eyes met, she did not cry, she did not speak. She only nodded and took the weapon he offered without hesitation. Elsewhere, the second woman knocked her guard unconscious with the strength of someone who had trained in another life, her chains falling away as her specter emerged from a storage hatch behind her, the hallway flooded with gas to cover their escape, the emergency lights flickering just long enough to reveal the specter's face covered in ash and blood. And resolve, he touched her shoulder, and she smiled, a silent promise that the Empire would pay for every second she spent in that cage. The third specter cut through 2 guards in the hallway leading to the blast doors, his blades spinning in controlled arcs, leaving no room for error. His movements practiced and deadly, and when he reached the third woman, she had already taken cover using a pipe torn from the cell wall as a weapon, blood on her lip but fire in her eyes, and together they moved like a single thought, hunting through the chaos for the exit. They would carve themselves all across the station, bodies dropped silently and quickly, taken by men who fought without sound and left no trace except fear. The fourth woman was already moving, with her specter using stolen armor to blend with the guards, and the fifth woman was pulled from her cell just as a thermal blast tore through the wall where she had knelt moments before, and through the smoke they moved as one, no longer dead, no longer shadows. They were wrath, they were war, and the Empire would never forget this night. When the flames cleared and the smoke curled through the shattered vents, like serpents fleeing from fire, the execution chamber stood in ruins. Sparks flying from broken walls, bodies scattered across the metal floor, some unconscious, some unmoving, and in the center where the pyre once roared there was only silence and absence and a jagged, opening cut straight through the platform, a wound in the Empire's pride, carved not by rebels or fleets or politics, but by 5 men who should have never come back. The warden crawled from beneath a collapsed beam, coughing blood and ash, his uniform torn, his speech lost, his voice silenced, and his eyes locked on the words etched into the side of the control panel. Burned deep into the steel with a combat knife, a message without mercy or confusion that read, "You nearly killed the wrong people again." And in that moment he understood, not just who they were but what had been unleashed, because this was not an escape, this was a reckoning. Auxiliary Bay, a stolen shuttle fired engines long dormant, its stealth plating flickering as power surged through systems. Rebuilt in secret, during the infiltration, the 5 Spectres and their wives moved in silence, each pair reunited, not with words, but with action, guarding, shielding, covering every step as alarms blared and station defenses activated. Too late, too slow, too broken. By the time anyone noticed the launch signature, it was already gone, leaving only black sky and fire in its wake. Across the galaxy the feeds slowly came back online. Scrambled chaotic news anchors stammered through incomplete reports, glitching footage, distorted audio, theories and panic and outrage and confusion, but no answers, because there were no fingerprints, no flags, no affiliations, only the undeniable truth that the Empire had failed to kill 5 prisoners, and now the galaxy was watching, not a flawless execution, but the return of something darker than rebellion and quieter than war. Somewhere far beyond the outer colonies, inside a hidden station shielded by abandoned wreckage and cloaked in old technology, the Spectres laid low once more, their mission complete, their silence returning. But this time they were not just ghosts of war, they were husbands, they were guardians, they were fury with memory, and now they knew the Empire had not forgotten them, and that meant the next war had already begun. Each woman bore her scars with quiet pride, trained now sharper than before, no longer civilians, no longer victims, but part of something greater, forged by fire and love and vengeance, and none of them spoke of what happened inside Zeta 9, because the silence was louder than any story, and the truth was carved into the bones of those who dared to look for it. The Empire issued no statement, held no press conference, launched no investigation, because to admit what had happened was to admit that even their most fortified prisons could be breached by ghosts, and that was a fear too great for them to name out loud. And so the Spectres vanished again into the stars, into the dark, where justice still waited in the shadows, silent, patient, and armed.